Teenage lobotomy, I want to be sedated, psychotherapy, my brain is hanging upside down, brain drain. Why this fascination with the brain?
We're screaming out for help.
I hope you get that.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim, Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey, Joey. Punk rock is Jewish. As today's guest has written, punk reflects the whole Jewish history of oppression and uncertainty, flight and wandering, belonging and not belonging, always being divided, being both in and out, good and bad, part and apart. The Spilkes, the nervous energy of punk, is Jewish.
We're delighted to talk with Steven Lee Beeber, a freelance journalist and author of The Heebie-Jeebies at CBGBs, A Secret History of Jewish Punk. Steven, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Oh, hi. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
What led you to explore the Jewish history of punk rock?
Well, I'm Jewish, and I grew up at a time when it wasn't that cool to be Jewish. You know, there was Barry Manilow, and as much as I like Paul Simon, he wasn't rock and roll, and, you know, Barbra Streisand and the like, but I liked rock and roll, and I did not have heroes, as it were. So, you know, like most Jews, I wouldn't say I do spot the Jew, but you do kind of notice when one crosses the radar. And I was at some point in I think it was the early 90s, when Perry Farrell of Jane's Addiction was talking about being into Kabbalah. And then Madonna was into Kabbalah, and Britney Spears, and Heebie magazine had appeared. I'm like, what the hell's going on? Jews are cool all of a sudden. So I start thinking about looking at this rise in, Jewish hit. And as I started looking at rock in general, it hit me, which I'm kind of amazed had never hit me before, how Jewish punk was. I mean, it's from New York. New York, for all its cultural cachet and like the center of American culture, has really had very few rock movements. There's the San Francisco scene, there's Athens, there's, grunge in Washington and Seattle. But New York really is only known for punk. And why? Because, well, it's the most New York of rock movements. And according to the Lenny Bruce formulation, it doesn't matter if you're Catholic. If you live in New York, you're Jewish. And I think that's so true of punk. Not only once I started to look more closely, a lot of the people whose names, were changed for the stage, they were Jewish, but their attitudes were so Jewish. Even some of the non-Jewish acts growing up around Jews and being New Yorkers were Jew-esque, let's say, not Jewish, Jew-esque. So that's kind of how I ended up there. And then, of course, the connection between Nazi imagery and punk and Jews seemed counterintuitive at first, and then so obvious, like hiding in plain sight. And, follow the money of kind of Watergate thing. The deeper I went, the more it became apparent that it was really something integral to the beginnings of punk, if not the most integral thing.
The spot the Jew tendency that a lot of us have, myself included, I mean, it can be done on a very superficial level where you're like, oh, isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? But when you start to analyze the individuals that we spot as Jews, it's very common that there's something really quite universal in the Jewish experience that is expressed through this person. I know that you found a lot of that in the punk movement.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I grew up in a Jewish family. I love my family, but it was always like, oh, so-and-so is Jewish. Like, so what? Unless there's something that is meaningful about it. And that's what I was looking for. Is there a common thread here other than an accident of being from the same background? In other words, how did that background affect them? And that, yeah, that's what really interests me, that sort of cultural studies component of it, American studies. And I, kind of looked at all the aspects of cultural Jewishness, not Judaism, though there's, bleed over, there's some relationship, but cultural Judaism, that idea of being outsiders and rootless cosmopolitans, right, who are critiquing the culture and making jokes about the culture and making jokes in part because the culture they have to deal with is oppressive. And in the history of oppression, for sure. I mean, the Holocaust is just the cherry on top of the history of Jewish oppression. It's the ultimate, but there are plenty others. Inquisition, Babylonian exile. You could, we all know we can find anyone anywhere in the world. People have hated us at some point and treated us badly, and the Holocaust, though, is such a impactful cultural trauma for Jews and really for Western civilization. That's, I think, why it doesn't matter in a sense if you're Jewish. That old Levy's rye commercial. You don't have to be Jewish to love Levy's rye. You don't have to be Jewish to get how horrible the Holocaust is, but it sure doesn't hurt to have, for it to strike a little deeper. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it does hurt, but it hurts so much because it's us.
Yeah. Right.
You note that Lenny Bruce is considered the patron saint of punk rock. Why is that?
A lot of the people who I interviewed, and I talked to about 150 people, in addition to doing, research and books and past interviews and that kind of thing. But so many of them mention Lenny Bruce as being really important to them growing up. These were, punk is early to mid 70s in New York. And so these are people who came of age in the mid to late 60s, right? Or even earlier. And that's Lenny Bruce's height of popularity. And he was synonymous with Jewish, synonymous with New York. He was cool. He was, a badass, as they said, a smart ass, and funny with an edge. He's all social critique, no taboos. And, Chris Stein, I remember from Blondie, who was partners, never married, but partners with Debbie Harry for before the band started and through the end of the band, talked to me about how he kind of recognized later in life, listening to Lenny Bruce again, talking about his own marriage to Honey Harlow, the Shiksa goddess, and how, he was attracted to her in part for that. And Chris jokingly, but also, with some truth, saying that resonated. That's kind of, I realized how much that is like me and Debbie. So they really just kind of came up in conversation, and then I started asking people because enough people mentioned it, and it sounded like just about everybody loved Lenny Bruce. Maybe except for the DA at the time in New York and most of America, but all the punks. All the punks liked Lenny Bruce a lot, like an adult, one of the adults they could look up to, as they put it.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe. You argue that these largely Jewish musicians, a generation removed from the Holocaust, were the first to truly break the silence. How did that play out?
When I wrote the book, I didn't actually even see a further connection that I've since kind of come upon, and that is the Eichmann trial, 1961, was not, it was a pivotal event in Holocaust history, because up until the Eichmann trial, people generally did not talk about the Holocaust. Immediately after the war, it was all but too painful to talk about. And it was, among Jews, considered somewhat shameful. It was really hard for survivors in that sense to not only have had to go through that, but then to be, on some level, not supported. I don't mean they were shunned and exiled, but people didn't want to advertise that aspect of Jewish as that victimhood as they saw it. When Eichmann was brought to trial, the idea for David Ben-Gurion and a lot of the other Israeli leaders was to use the trial for justice, obviously. I mean, who deserves to go on trial more than Eichmann? But to publicize why there was an Israel, that was that there was a need for a haven of sorts, because there were people like this out there at very high levels of power, and it could happen again. So that trial was one of the first, if not the first, really, broadcast on network television. And there were excerpts every day. And in New York, they were not just excerpts. It was like, I don't know if either of you are old enough to remember the Watergate hearings, but those were on TV, would ruin the cartoons on certain days, and Gilligan's Island you couldn't see.
For us, it was the O.J. Simpson trial.
There you go. There you go. Equivalent. Yeah. We preempt this message. And so preempting that message in New York for long stretches of time was the Eichmann trial. And it was graphic. I mean, on purpose. They really were honest about what had happened in the camps and in Germany in general. And the children who were watching that were the punks. You start to see beginnings of the late 60s into the 70s, lots of movies, television shows, books, directly about the Holocaust and indirectly just about Jews. Jews suddenly become very interesting to people. Philip Roth, Saul Bellow, Bernard Malamud, and writing on television. You got, Bridget Loves Bernie, Rhoda, Holocaust, the miniseries with Meryl Streep, and theater, Sophie's Choice, Woody Allen, Elliot Gould, leading men. I mean, Jews as leading men would have been unheard of at one time. Elliot Gould, Dustin Hoffman, Richard Dreyfuss, lots and lots of very openly, not just coded Jewish. They were clearly Jewish. Springtime for Hitler, the producers, Mel Brooks movie in which he uses the Nazis for humor. And that's what the punks did. And a lot of people misunderstood at the time and thought they were just being insensitive, offensive. Well, I mean, one can make the argument it's kind of insensitive, but one can make the argument, just as Jews have always done to cope with oppression and difficulty, they've made jokes. Today, and I guess the equivalent would be, Black people using the N-word. They reappropriate it, turn it into something that doesn't have the power anymore, because who is using it? Who's the one that's in charge of it? Well, they are. And that's a lot of what the Nazi imagery in punk was about, and some very funny jokes about Nazis. They saved Hitler's cock, they put it in a box, was one of my favorite lyrics from one of the punk bands of the time. So,
well, I'm also thinking how Jews were not the only ones who suffered at the hands of Nazis. And so I think maybe Jewish punks were sort of dabbling in intersectionality as opposed to exceptionalism. They weren't saying Jews were the only ones who suffered, but they were sort of leading the charge of the, anti-fascist, fuck Nazi kind of movement.
Absolutely. I mean, if you want to call the original punks the original Antifa, I think you're absolutely right. It was fascism in general, and it wasn't just the Jews. It was the punks in general, recognizing that this kind of tendencies. I mean, especially once Reagan came around in 1980. But the punks. I think one thing people forget, because punks hated hippies, they always say, but a lot of the punks, the early punks, were hippies, but they were at that end of the hippie movement that was more yippie, Jerry Rubin, Abby Hoffman, politically revolutionary. And they wanted to bring back that element of rock and roll, the basic rebellious nature of rock and roll, the democratic impulse in rock. Anybody can play it if they have something to say and the passion to say it. All of the punks were, addressing not just the Holocaust in history, but the potential of Holocaust thinking, ideology, right-wing ideology to create darkness and When Joey Ramone wrote the Ramone song "Bonzo Goes to Bitburg" about Reagan going to a cemetery in Bitburg, Germany, honoring the SS. It's different to honor fallen drafted soldiers and who fought, in World War II. That's understandable. It's not their fault, really. But the SS, you had to pay your dues and prove you were really loyal. And I mean, what are we doing honoring the SS? So yeah. And like I say, if in the book, but I would even, I think, stress it more now if I were to go back and revisit it. The non-Jews who also were very impacted by the story of Western civilization and what it was capable of, if you want to just put it into a bigger umbrella. Iggy Pop, then Iggy Stooge, or the Stooges, had I think it was called The Rape of the Virgin, is what he called the act. And it was him being stomped on and literally bloodied by Ron Ashton, one of the band members, wearing a Nazi uniform. And Iggy used to date Jewish women almost exclusively. I think married a Jewish woman eventually. And his father was actually raised by two Jewish sisters. And Iggy, when he was dating this one Jewish woman at the time who was a child of Holocaust survivors, he said, "I have a surprise for you at tonight's show." He thought she would love, because like cathartic, and he did the Rape of the Virgin. She hated it. She's like, "What the hell?" But he meant well. He meant well. He was trying to exorcise the demon in a way, right? I mean, even the Sex Pistols, for all their questionable practices, the Holidays in the Sun, talking about, would go to a New Belsen. Well, it wasn't like they wanted to go to a concentration camp for a vacation. They were making fun of people who go to like third world countries and enjoy themselves while there's misery all around them. And like, so they're making a parallel. Like I'd like to go on a vacation to Belsen, that'd be great. So yeah, I think you're right about the intersectionality. It wasn't just Jews, gay people, Romani people, many Catholics, any political enemies. The original concentration camp was for political enemies in Dachau, Germany. So I'm not telling you anything you don't know. I'm just saying I absolutely agree with you that yeah, I think that mm, the intersectionality of it is definitely part of it. Yeah.
How should we assess the impact of the Ramones and specifically its frontman, Joey Ramone, born Jeffrey Hyman?
Well, Joey is such a paradigm shift in rock. Joey was, and I don't mean this in any knock against Joey. I loved Joey, and everybody did. Everybody called him a Mensch, right? That was the term always used for him. But he was a little freakish looking. If you look at the average person, he was very, very tall. I think he was 6'8", something like that. Grew up, feet taller than his kids in high school. And later he put on a little weight, but he was emaciated. So it was all the more exaggerated. He had a big hook nose and, kind of bad posture due to some physical conditions, and looked like one of those stereotypes of Jews in the Der Stürmer, the Nazi newspaper, a caricature of a Jew. He was anything but what was at the time seen as a rock star. Rock star was Robert Plant with his shirt unbuttoned to the navel and tight jeans and cock rocker, like it's all sex and stud and I'm in charge. And Joey was like, "I'm a freak, you're a freak, we're all freaks. That's cool. Gabba gabba, hey, one of us, one of us." Yeah, that the gabba gabba hey comes from the movie Freaks. So it was actually gobble gobble hey in the movie, but it was the chant of all the freaks. And I'm, again, quotation marks around freaks, but uh, bonding together and putting a spell on someone who was cruel to them, who was the beauty, the blonde beauty. So Joey was kind of the emblematic of it in so many ways. And so much of punk is about neuroses and about being broken and twisted. And yet it's an anti-hero, right? Because if you were in this culture and you're paying attention, you really should be broken and twisted. You know, if you're not upset, there's something wrong. If you're not wounded by the culture, there's something wrong. Joey, what's interesting to me, especially about Joey, is that Tommy, who the other Jewish member of the Ramones, who no one knew was Jewish, including their Jewish manager, Danny Fields, until I told him. Tommy was very self-conscious about it. It was Tommy who insisted to the other two, Dee Dee and Johnny, that Joey be the lead singer. They're like, what? That's insane. Like, he's not, I mean, they knew he could sing, but he just like, he looked ridiculous as the leader of a band. And Tommy said, no, that's the point. That's what we are. That's the kind of band we are, where he's the leader. Tommy was a child of Holocaust survivors who were hidden or protected by non-Jewish friends in Budapest during World War II. And they fled in 56 with the Soviet, when the Soviets kind of crushed a rebellion and anti-Semitism was on the rise. They're like, we've been through this once. We're not here for that again. And Tommy was, I don't think paranoid's the right word, because, if they're after you, you're not paranoid. So, but he was very alert and cautious. Never denied his Jewishness, was proud of it, but didn't advertise it. And his vision for the Ramones was really a very Jewish vision. And the fact that the Ramones, and I'm sorry to veer from Joey, but Joey's so integral to the Ramones. Like, you can't talk about John Lennon without talking about the other Beatles, right? They're that kind of band where the four distinct personalities make up a whole. Johnny collected Nazi memorabilia and was known to say anti-Semitic things. Was it just to wind people up, or was he questionable? It's a, who knows? It's a little, no one knows what's in someone's heart, but he sure did hurt people like Joey and Tommy. Tommy had to drop out of the band in part because of Johnny. That's why he left. Dee Dee, whose mother was German, whose father was an American serviceman who married her while stationed in Germany at occupying force, had a very conflicted relationship towards Germany. But to piss off his father, he collected Nazi memorabilia as a kid. And the two of them were somewhat counterposed against Joey and Tommy. And together, those preoccupations came up, and yet in a comic context. It was kind of, Tommy especially would take those songs and make them funnier so that the Nazis seemed kind of ridiculous. And Joey, obviously, later with Bonzo Goes to Bitburg, part of that as well directly. And that was a song originally Johnny did not want Reagan named in the title. It was called My Brain is Hanging Upside Down, which is the chorus. And, Johnny was a big supporter of the police and Reagan, and supposedly had a photo of Hitler over his fireplace. I never saw it, so I can't say for sure that's true, but I heard that. And anyway, so there are a lot of negotiations in there that reflected bigger schisms, and not even just on the Ramones. It's in other bands too. Kiss was sort of punk adjacent, same time period. Some of the same fright elements, like for Kiddies, and they were split between two Jews and one hardcore anti-Semite, Nazi sympathizer. So
it's just fascinating that these bands were able to be friends, we can assume, and work together, despite that kind of deal breaker in most relationships.
Yeah, the Ramones are also known as the most dysfunctional band in history. And they really were. They hated each other by the end. Joey would sit in the back of the bus, Johnny in the front. Joey, I mean, I don't mean to sound like I'm mocking. I mean, he had, like everyone, had his issues, but he was OCD, very clearly. Had to touch they would try to leave to go on tour, and he'd have to go up and down the steps of his apartment like for an hour, touching certain things over and over sometimes. Um, you know, Johnny, who found Joey intolerable, was his own kind of OCD. He was obsessed with baseball statistics to the point that it was like reams and reams of notebooks, keeping track of everything. Tommy was probably depressive, seemed like. And Dee Dee was a mystery, hard to tell, bipolar perhaps, um, not schizophrenic, but everyone commented on how he could turn. There were like two Dee Dees, this sweet, innocent, almost childlike, to the point of that being almost creepy. Like, how is he not more, grown up, and a kind of cruel, violent character. Very talented, hugely talented, also hugely important to the Ramones. I don't mean to make it out Tommy was the Ramones, not by far. The Beatles, they got to dislike each other. I don't know the Ramones ever liked each other that much. You see those early films, I think it's one of their first shows at CB's, and they're fighting on stage about which song to do next. They're really fighting. It wasn't an act. It was funny, but it was supposedly real.
Our next selection is entitled Judy is a Punk. Ready? Let's go. Can't take it. Let's go. Come on. 1, 2. All right. 1, 2, 3.
Turning to CB's, Jews were also central behind the scenes, like Hilly Crystal, owner of the punk mecca CBGB. What was the significance of Crystal and that club?
Well, Hillel Crystal is his real name, was his name. Interesting character. Grew up on a Zionist socialist collective, and this is back when Zionism wasn't considered a dirty word. It was the lefty version of Israel, where you went to a kibbutz and you shared the wealth. His great uncle was head of this collective in the Jersey homestead, and Hilly grew up there. The idea, just as it was in Israel, was for Jews to get back to the land. It was kind of a romantic era response to displacement, a romantic era of like Beethoven, that kind of romantic era, that you get back to the soil, kind of like the hippies were, right? Rousseau and Beethoven, and our natural healthiest selves were out of cities, were in touch with the soil, and the thinking was among the original Zionists that Jews had been divorced from that kind of connection to the land, that they had been dispossessed of that, and that they needed a literal place where they could till the land and be workers and be strong and healthy and all spiritually as well as physically. Hilly was a strong, big strong guy, but also loved music and wanted to play violin, and was very good. Was playing violin all through his youth and high school years. He had a sister who was ill. He needed to take care of her. And he couldn't pursue that in the way he wanted, but he did finally go to New York and pursue singing. That he also had a great voice, and he worked in a number of venues, and then kind of segued from that into clubs, managing clubs. He interacted with a lot of the famous jazz musicians, and then he in the early 70s decided he was going to open his own club, and he picked the Bowery because it was cheap and uncharted territory, and he opened CBGB's, Country, Bluegrass, and Blues. It was an Americana music club. Did not do very well. It was inhabited by bikers initially, and it wasn't until Richard Hill, Richard Myers, and Tom Verlaine um, came to him and said, "We have a band, we want to play." And Hilly said, "You know what? You can play, but you have to play your own music," which was not common in New York at the time at all. There were cover bands everywhere. And he's like, "You've got to play your own music." And that was his line to everyone. You got to play your own music. All those early bands that germinated and gestated at CB's would never have gotten gigs elsewhere. They were bad, and they, by their own minutes, they started out bad. And Hilly said to me, "I didn't like them, but I thought they deserved a chance. I thought they were doing their own thing. Do it yourself." And he said, "I wish someone had given me that. I grew up on the Jersey Home Store. The whole idea was not workers alone, but, empowerment of individuals, the common man, the folk. The original meaning of folk is just the regular people, right? Volkswagen and folk. So folk music, which was the big movement in New York before punk, Dylan and the rest of them. He wanted that a place for the folk. And so he was DIY before there was a term for it. And he created the literal setting for punk to be born. And, we should just say that, for years, decades, people said, "Oh, no, punk started in England." And there was some, "No, it started in New York, it started in England, it started in New York." Well, I'm clearly on the side it started in New York. And I think one of the ways you can tell it started in New York is that the Ramones played a July 4th Independence Day show at the Roundhouse in London, a big club. In attendance were members of the Damned, what became, I should say, the Damned, what became the Sex Pistols, what became the Clash, and all of them were hugely inspired. And if you listen to early Clash songs like White Riot, it's basically a Ramones song with one short guitar solo. Ramones didn't have guitar solos. But other than that, it's a great song. And I have no problem with people sounding like the Ramones, but it clearly has its precedent in the Ramones. Yeah, so Hilly was huge. Hilly was huge. And, if nothing else, he had a club where he allowed his dogs to run around and shit everywhere. People would always comment there was dog shit all over the club. And the bathrooms were legendary or infamous in their disgustingness. And, if nothing else, if Hilly had just done that, he would have helped to create punk, because punk is grungy, unkempt and sordid, and wallows in the, I wouldn't call it the dark side, the smelly side.
Did he ever come around to liking that music aesthetically, or was it just sort of a business thing?
Yeah, like I say, I think, a lot of those bands weren't good in the beginning. I mean, television became amazing. The Ramones, yeah, they're very loose and disorganized in the beginning, and then they were very powerful once they kind of got it to click and things to fall in place. And yeah, Hilly, then let's not forget, he was a manager and a music label owner later. So yeah, he liked the music, and he liked the attitude. He liked what he saw as a real New York kind of music. And punk was originally called, if you think of punk as starting in New York music, there was no term for it.
You quote avant-garde jazz musician John Zorn, who says that Jews are contrary by definition. How does this apply to punk rock Jews?
Well, I don't agree with John Zorn. No, just trying to be contrary. No, it definitely, the old joke, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, right? Yeah, punk was confrontational and argumentative with the culture. It critiqued the culture. It didn't accept, question authority, all that stuff, the bumper stickers you would see around. And Jews, for good reason, have traditionally been that way, because the culture ends up treating them questionably. So they don't trust all of the patriotic notions that often are touted as being the principles of the civilization and of the moment. The Nazis, they thought they were good citizens, and that's what their government was telling them. And a Jew is not just because of that experience, but many experiences doesn't take verbatim, take unquestioningly the precepts and principles of any given movement, creed, even the Judaism. That's why I was saying it isn't. I talk about cultural Jewishness, what's called Yiddishkeit, I think, in academic circles, but the Jews were and still are a religion, and the religion has something to do with that, and the religion is very, I would say, proudly questioning that the rabbinical tradition is one of interpretation and argument and debate, and even in the Torah, the Bible, the characters are questioning God. They don't just have blind faith. They're in dialogue, and so the contradictory nature, the uh, in the sense of questioning, absolutely. And I think living in a position of being both in and out of many cultures, you can't help but feel somewhat internally that way too. Kind of torn between attitudes, which I think is super healthy personally. Irony, people, you treat your own highest beliefs with some level of irony, question them, kind of stand apart and think about them. And that I think is healthy. Fascists were anything but humorous, anything but ironic. It was all black and white, all really simplistic, easy answers that are maybe it makes you feel good if you're on the inside, but if you're the one who's the enemy, the Jew or the immigrant, raping immigrant who comes in, like all of them are just rapists and criminals, feels pretty good, just like be on the other side. Not so good for them. So, yeah, I think that's what Zoran was talking about. And I absolutely agree with him that that's very punk. That couldn't be more punk.
Do you think that the sound of punk rock is in some way Jewish?
The harsh rawness of it, that's abrasive and not just gently melodic and things are easy, easy listening. That's so Jewish. Jews are in a state of agitation, often for good reason. I attribute so much of it to their cultural positioning. It's sort of a byproduct of being a minority, a maligned minority that has almost become a easy go-to. It's just sort of self-perpetuating. The more every era decides the Jews are to blame, the more that next era can think, well, the Jews have always been to blame. They're to blame. So that sound, and in fact, if you look at movements in what we call classical music, around the turn of the century, previous century, the 20s, Schoenberg and all that discordant nature of that. Was supposed to reflect, they said, the feelings in society and culture of fragmentation that were going on, post World War I especially, and post World War II even more so. It's like if World War I was a horrible slaughter that made you lose faith in civilization, well, you'll really love World War II. It's even more so. And that sound is, it's the one, it's kind of what I'm referring to in the title, the Heebie-Jeebies at CBGs. It's a mixture of Spilka's nervousness, and Spilka's itself is a mixture of nervous energy, excitement almost, but also agitation and feeling ill at ease and having to do something or you're going to jump out of your skin. So the music of punk definitely has that. It also, we should note, is intentionally what we might call simplistic. I would call it minimalist, just like the classical music of that period. Same exact period. Philip Glass, Steve Reich, Terry Riley, minimalism was going on at the same time. And, the Velvet Underground, who are often thought of as the godfathers of punk along with Iggy Pop, had, Lou Reed, Louis Rabinowitz as their leader, But almost equally important in the beginning was John Cale, who was a classically trained minimalist musician who brought the drone, an element of minimalism, into that music. And if you want to hear discordant sounding music, listen to the earlier Velvet Underground. The Black Angels' Death Song is, for many people, unlistenable. If you do listen to the lyrics, it's interesting. It seems to be about the killing fields of Eastern Europe during World War II, I think is what it is poetically referring to. Just like John Zorn's Kristallnacht has elements, it's in different movements, right? But some of them are hard to listen to. I don't think you could write easy to listen to music about a Holocaust. It should sound that way. And punk was meant to reflect that. But as I was saying, also the simplicity, the democratic, primal, the folks element of everyone can do this. And we shouldn't forget that what became punk was as much a concept in the mind of rock critics originally as it was a music. It was, and all of those rock critics, 90% of them were Jewish and very self-conscious about it. Like Sandy Pearlman, and Richard Meltzer, The Aesthetics of Rock, kind of the Bible before Grail Marcus and Lipstick Traces. That was Sandy Pearlman, who went on to create really so much of what made the Blue Oyster Cult successful. And what the Blue Oyster Cult had was a playful and yet sinister preoccupation with fascism and Nazi imagery that got them banned in Germany, in fact. So, yeah, definitely, I think that's a very Jewish aspect of punk. I don't want to. Let me rephrase that. I don't want to say Jews alone, because again, I think so many people were traumatized by, are traumatized by history and what they see we're capable of. You don't have to be Jewish to reflect the Holocaust, reflect the atom bomb. I mean, what was 1950 sci-fi horror films, but this fear of technology gone mad and what we could do. Godzilla is the ultimate atomic weapon come back to wreak vengeance on everyone. So yeah, I think it's absolutely correct that the abrasiveness of the music reflects the abrasiveness of history and its impact on Jews and non-Jews alike.
Do you have an opinion of the modern colloquial usage of punk? I hear a lot these days people saying kindness is punk rock or love is punk rock.
Yeah, no, Tikkun Olam, which is, heal the world through good acts, and calling, pointing out the evil in the world, the fascism inherent in our culture is a healing gesture. It's a kind of love, even if it's about, in the form of snot jokes and freaks and the rest of it, and shouting. You have to shout to be heard. It doesn't mean, for all the anger you feel, anger is not the opposite of love. Anger is caring, and you're angry about something that is hateful. Is the opposite of love. So yeah, in that sense, punk is love. Yeah, I agree.
Thank you so much, Steven, for joining us.
Thank you. That was great. I had a good time.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.